Ben, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Martin. Thank you, Abigail. It's great to be here. And in particular, in terms of the all-party group, it's very good to have the connection between ourselves and Orbit, because obviously you are a great source of information on this whole area. And it's great to be here, I suppose, on the first day of the parliamentary term in the autumn, starting back. We start before the academic term, of course. You know, we work a bit harder in Parliament. But I just really wanted to run through a number of the issues, but especially in the context of the title of the conference today. Because I expect many of you have read the report, many of you have probably been to various other gatherings that there have been over the last few months. You know, not a week goes by, as far as I can see, without some new conference on AI. But what I like particularly today is your focus on the ethical aspects of it. And that, of course, was very much what we were focusing on in our report, which we published back, it seems a long time ago now, back in April. Now, I hope that this is going to work. I don't know whether if I press something here, it's going to produce the goods in terms of the presentation. Is there some way that if I press a button, it's going to start with my first slide?
I'm sure we can make it work. Which one is that on yours? Orbit presentation?
No.
Yeah, it looks like
Oh, yes, is that the one?
Yeah.
It's been converted to the latest version of PowerPoint.
There we go.
You see, you get an instant upgrade if you come to Microsoft. So this is pretty impressive.
You can use that.
I can use that. Thanks very much indeed.
Let's hope it works.
Thank you, Abigail. Thanks very much. Right. Well, of course, the context, and you only know this too well, if you talk to anybody for about 5 minutes, people start polarizing into optimists and pessimists. Of course, Elon Musk is a very well-known pessimist, as was, of course, Stephen Hawking. And I don't need to tell you much about what they had to say about it, but some fairly extravagant language, I think, used in the context. And then, of course, you have the absolute uber optimists, people like Nathan Marvold, of course, who has previous form with Microsoft, I think. But I don't blame Microsoft for his over-optimism. But he believes that the market can sort everything out. Now there are some distance between those two positions. I think as a committee, we like to think that essentially AI was all pervasive. So. I think Sundar Pichai's views on the matter in terms of seeing it more as a utility that we had to come to terms with, a rather important utility, but nevertheless one that was all pervasive, and we really had to come to grips with that in a more realistic way, if you like. Of course, and all of you know this, it's very high on the UK political agenda. I mean, in the midst of Brexit, the Prime Minister managed to talk about this at Davos. Now, whether that was a distraction for her or something that was a really important policy initiative, time will only tell. She happened to have a pretty good Secretary of State for DCMS at the time. I don't know whether our current Secretary of State, our new Secretary of State, quite has the same kind of considerations and expertise in this area. I do hope so. But it does mean that actually we've published an industrial strategy with AI being one of the 4 grand challenges. We've had an AI sector deal. You know, they're both reasonably ambitious. We obviously, as part of our report, make sure that we do kick the tires a fair bit on government policy, but nevertheless heading in the right direction. And the EU, of course, heading in a pretty similar sort of direction, perhaps not quite as comprehensive, because after all their role is to take rather more of a helicopter view. But certainly both do take on board some of the ethical aspects. They do take on board not only the opportunities, but some of the risks that need to be looked at. And that certainly was our approach when we came to study the issue. So over a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, we were tasked with considering the economic, ethical and social implications of advances in artificial intelligence. Now, you'd think that was a pretty broad area. What we had to try and do was kind of compartmentalize that to some degree. So looking at how AI really does affect people in their everyday lives and how this is likely to change. And of course, what was so interesting about what Abigail had to say was that we're hitting a moving target. I mean, here we are as policymakers breathlessly trying to keep up with a torrent of books, papers, developments, research and so on during the time that we're trying to produce this report. Now, I hope we've succeeded at least with a little bit of an encapsulation of the here and now. But of course, life has already moved on, and I, am amazed by the developments that have taken place even since our report was published in April. And that means people's consideration of policies, but also the way that technology has moved on as well. At the second issue, the potential opportunities presented by artificial intelligence, but also, and this is very much the kind of precautionary basis on which we looked at the subject, but possible risks and implications of artificial intelligence, how these can be avoided, how can we engage the public in a responsible manner about AI. We were very conscious of some of the issues in this area. We were very conscious of some of the history, if you like, of some technology such as GM foods. We didn't want to repeat ourselves in that area where people become technology averse. We wanted to make sure that anything we put forward was designed to retain public trust and advise government how to retain public trust. I suppose the better example, the example that we wanted to follow, was more to do with human fertilization and embryology, where we did get that right, where people didn't become over risk averse and where the public accepted the new technology. So in a sense, we had two rather contrasting examples of what worked and what didn't work in terms of the new technologies. And then, of course, finally, what are the ethical issues presented by the development and use of artificial intelligence? And at the end of the day, as I think you'll see, we were very conscious that that really was the overarching issue. And I suppose I encapsulate that by saying that AI should be our servant, not our master. And how can we make sure in the future that that is the case? Now, of course, when you're doing a study of this kind, and you no doubt have exactly the same in your academic work, you have to start off with a few definitions. And we thought that the government definition that they used in the Industrial Strategy White Paper, that I think Dame Wendy Hall and Jerome Pacenti used in their paper, was a little bit simplistic. They used a definition, technologies with the ability to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, and language translation. Well, we didn't think that really captured enough of the autonomous nature or the potential autonomous nature of AI. And we're not even talking about strong AI or general AI or super intelligence or whatever. We're talking about narrow, weak AI. We still believe that when you're talking about AI in that context, you should build in that autonomous aspect so that where the algorithm is actually learning of its own volition, if you like, from the data that's presented to it, that it's first trained on, that has to be incorporated in the definition. Because that's, in a sense, where quite a lot of the ethical issues may well arise in the future. So, of course, we were very conscious, and again, coming back to what Abigail had to say, we were very conscious that actually AI is not just a futuristic thing, it's here and now. We did a rather fanciful little sort of narrative at the beginning of our report. We talked about somebody getting up in the morning and you see how AI is absolutely embedded in their lives, whether it's at home, it's in the social media, it's in education, it's in their car, it's in healthcare, it's in the supermarket, it's in leisure, and so on. Not all of the AI that we talk about in that little vignette is here and now in everybody's lives, but actually nearly all of the AI that we mention in that little story is here in some shape or form in quite a large number of people's lives. Just a few headlines about the report before I come on to the detail. We took the view that we were in a strong position to be a world leader in the development of artificial intelligence. This position, coupled with the wider adoption of AI, could deliver a major boost to the economy for years to come. And I'm not going, and we didn't get into the whole issue about productivity and so on, but obviously we do believe that we have a reasonable chance of improving productivity by the adoption of AI. But of course, as we know, our record in this area as an economy is not wonderful. So I think placing bets on this is not the great thing. I think what we hope is that AI has other purposes just than simply economic, and that it has a potential to be a benefit to society for reasons entirely separate from productivity and so on. Just coming on to the other reasons, we have a whole ecosystem of opportunity, leading artificial intelligence companies, many of them spin-outs from universities. We have a dynamic academic research culture, as you only know too well, here in Cambridge. And actually, of course, we visited Cambridge. We visited Microsoft, actually, as part of our inquiry. And we found that actually, examining those clusters, those ecosystems, was extremely useful. We got some very helpful contacts as part of that. Vigorous startup ecosystem. We may not be as good at Silicon Valley at the growth areas, but we certainly in some of our clusters, Manchester, London, Shoreditch, for instance, Cambridge, we do have a very good startup ecosystem. And then, of course, we have quite a good legal, ethical, financial, and linguistic aspect to give us certain advantages. Now, of course, and I may, if I have time, come on to this later, the tables, or the league international tables, are a little bit variable, but there's certainly fairly good reason to think that that is not an over-optimistic assessment of where we are. When you look at some of those league tables, the economists may mark us down a bit, others mark us up a bit, but we are there or thereabouts, certainly in the top 5, I would say, still. And then, of course, I've talked about the fact that we adopted a precautionary approach. It's essential that ethics is considered central to development and use. Ethical approach ensuring the public trusts AI, seeing the benefit of using it, and also, in a sense, give the public digital understanding so it helps them prepare to challenge the misuse of AI, which is a very important part of this. So putting ethics at the centre of AI's development and use, as long as we take that on board, as well as, if you like, using the opportunities, we can shape it positively for public benefit, and we can lead the international community. And in a sense, we took a bit of a flyer by saying that we thought we could take a leadership position, especially given sort of current political circumstances where we have other distractions. But we really did believe that we had got a number of particular elements together in time to be able to be an international leader. And I'll come on to that a little bit more in a few minutes. Just coming on to the key themes, because I'll unpack those a little bit as we go along. I've talked about the UK leadership in the development and use of AI, but I'll just talk a little bit about some of the initiatives, some of the incentives that can be built in. But really, I want to talk more about these other 4 themes: inclusion and diversity, equipping people for the future, control over data, and then the ethical framework for AI, which in a sense incorporates quite a lot of those different elements. Opportunities through leadership. Well, we heard about leadership this morning. We do need a national framework. We do need the Government Office for AI to really take a leading role in this across government departments. They've started pretty well. They've got a very powerful team, actually, very enthusiastic team, which is just being put together. But there are things like targeted government procurement, which we really need to make sure are developed. And we need much more investment, for instance, in the way that our data sets are put together in the health service. It's quite interesting with Matt Hancock moving across to the health service that may well take place actually rather faster than it would have done under a previous incumbent. And of course, there are issues about companies. You know, just down the road, DeepMind is a classic example, really, of where they decided economically, they really, if they were going to develop and grow, they really had to make a sale. They didn't really have the ability to float at that particular time or list or get further capital which would be sufficient for their needs. And what we don't want to do is it's fine if people do want to sell to exit at a particular point, but it must be really of their own volition, and they must have the other choices that they can make in the financial markets if they want to retain autonomy over their own company. And I think that's a very important aspect. So we made a number of recommendations about the British Business Bank. A theme that runs all the way through our report is the whole issue of inclusion and diversity. And it was very interesting to see that was up in Abigail's slide as well. Because this is a vital component in many of the areas covered by our report. And we basically went through all these. I think in particular we said that the prejudices of the past mustn't be unwittingly built into automated systems. That is absolutely crucial, because so much of the data on which our algorithms are going to be trained is past data which may incorporate many of those prejudices. So what we need to do is make sure that we have the ability to audit those data sets, make sure that we understand those algorithms sufficiently to make sure that we know whether or not those prejudices are being incorporated. And, you know, in many ways we don't yet have the proper tools, and they do need to be developed. And in a sense, what we need to be is more sensitized to the fact that algorithms and our AI may incorporate prejudice. If you're very monoculture, then you may not recognize that actually those algorithms are incorporating bias. So the very aspect of diversity in the training and recruitment of AI specialists is important. And we made a suggestion which we thought was important. It may be slow to take up by industry and business, but establishing a voluntary mechanism to inform consumers when AI is being used to make significant or sensitive decisions. Now, that is quite difficult, but, you know, the fact is, I think it's going to be quite important for people to know when they are dealing with AI or a chatbot or whatever it may be in the future. And I think the blurring of that distinction is not going to be very helpful for public trust in the future, where they don't really know what is happening to them. The next key area is the whole area of equipping people for the future. And this whole issue of job loss or potential job loss, you know, it fluctuates in terms of public debate. But, you know, we only had Andy Haldane, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, who raised all this only a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, what was quite interesting was, you know, the Bank of England actually should get much more of its facts right. It should look back at some of the more recent research. He seemed to be simply relying on sort of old Frey and Osborne papers, where actually even Frey and Osborne themselves, when they talk about this, have a rather different view. I mean, they say our estimates have often been taken to imply an employment apocalypse, which in a sense was what Haldane was saying, yet that is not what we intended or suggested. All we showed is that the potential scope of automation is vast, just as it was on the eve of the second industrial revolution before electricity, etc., etc. So it's very easy, I think, to get alarmist about this. And you know, I'll come on to public opinion in a minute about this, but this is, I think, one of the key areas where we were quite wary of going down a particular track. We've seen other reports subsequently. We've seen the PwC report, which was more upbeat. We've seen OECD OECD reports, which are more upbeat. I think the thing to do is to try and focus on what is needed by way of reskilling for those already in employment and by way of training and skilling for those not yet in employment. And I think that is absolutely crucial. But of course, there will be churn, but there will be new jobs created, as many people believe. But significant government intervention will be needed, investment in skills, and we need to make sure that there is a confidence about the future that sort of programme engenders. Retraining will become a lifelong necessity. I don't think anybody argues with the fact that we are going to need to be more adaptable, more agile in the future employment market. As part of all of this, it isn't purely about education and skills. People like Martha Lane Fox with Everyone, people who run Five Rights and so on, are very, very clear that the essence of this is also about digital understanding. In order to operate in society, it isn't just a question of having the formal skills of working with AI or understanding AI. It is basically about how we use and understand AI in our everyday lives, even if, we're not going to be coding or doing anything technical in our professional employment. And that is, I think, something that government really does have to take on board. And then, of course, the ethical design and use of AI should be an integral part of the curriculum. We have this concept that technology is value-free. Well, yeah, that may be the case, but we need to make sure that actually when we do put technology into practice, it is within a moral and an ethical framework. So just coming on a little bit to the question of public opinion. Now, at the time we published our report, this was the sort of most likely state of public opinion. It may have shifted somewhat since then, and there are variable opinion polls on this. But what this, to us, indicated that there was a window of opportunity in terms of keeping public trust, that net not worried was something still there and still would enable us to make sure that government had a space of time in which to make sure that their retraining plans, that their investment in skills plans and so on could come to fruition and would be visible to the public. And I think that's what I would say about that. Is that even if that net not worried figure is coming down somewhat over a period of time, especially when people like the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England start getting us all worried, that we still have a little opportunity there to make sure that we can create a kind of climate where people do not feel that in 20 years' time, 10 years' time, 5 years' time, they're all going to be put on the scrap heap. And that is, I think, a really important societal aspect of all of this. One of the really important areas is what kind of skills are we going to need in the future? And a recent report coming out of Oxford Martin, I'm sorry to keep using the word Oxford in this context, coming out of Oxford Martin, also talks about the sort of top 10 skills that are going to be needed in the future. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating. And I'll come on to the government response to our report in a couple of minutes. But the government are fixated on coding and computer skills and maths and so on, when any technologist will tell you, and it was very interesting again in Abigail's presentation, that there is an emphasis on creativity as well and on creative skills. And the top 10 skills mentioned in this Oxford Martin report with judgment and decision making, fluency of ideas, active learning, learning strategies, originality, systems evaluation, well, you could say that's a technology, deductive reasoning, again, that's probably common between the humanities and science, complex problem solving, systems analysis, monitoring. So actually it's weighted at the top of the table towards the creative skills and, if you like, the humanities. And I think that's something that we really need to take on board in the future. The next key area is this whole area of control over data. Now, of course, we've all been living, eating and breathing the GDPR probably over the past year or so. and I had the very mixed privilege of taking the bill through the House of Lords of my party. So that was quite a long process of trying to understand what on earth this massive EU directive, EU regulation was all about, that is directly applicable except as derogated from by UK legislation. So you had to keep going back and forward between an EU regulation and a UK Act of Parliament or bill. And so, at the end of the day, I think it's one of the most obscure pieces of legislation that man or beast has actually put into effect. But we will see. We will see. I'm sure there's a greater degree of understanding than one imagines. But I know that it's already created huge issues. But what I think we need to take from all of this is that we need to simplify people's rights in this area, and we need to make sure that the way in which data is gathered and accessed does need to keep up to date, needs to change so that everyone can have fair access to data. But citizens and consumers can protect their privacy and personal agency. I don't believe that the data protection rules currently are a full stop. I think there's room for more development. We've now got portability, data portability, which is a useful concept in terms of at least testing what information technology companies have on you. But nevertheless, there are other concepts, the use of data trusts, hubs of all things, and so on, which will develop our understanding and the requirements of data protection law. And I think that will be coming down the track as time goes on. But I think the most important conclusion, because I don't think we were really in a position to comment on, the GDPR at this particular moment until we see particular issues. We did look at the treatment of autonomous algorithms, automated decision making. And we did comment that we didn't think that was actually fit for purpose, particularly because, of course, there's only a right to explainability if it is fully automated. There is no right to explainability if there is human intervention. And, of course, it's very easy to put in human intervention. And there is commentary by I think it's called the Article 27 Working Party in Europe, but nevertheless, we think that was really not quite up to scratch. But the really important thing for the future is this concentration of power over data sets, what we loosely call data monopolies. And we said that this really does need reviewing in the future. And of course, there are a certain number of major technology companies that have massive data sets. And the essence of it is, are our smaller startup companies able to get access to this? Does this create a public detriment in terms of innovation and so on and so forth? That's really the test that one should use. So we basically took a look at that. And it's very interesting, actually, that the government have now appointed Jason Furman, Professor Jason Furman, Obama's ex-chief economic advisor, to examine the competitiveness of the tech market with an expert panel. So I think that's probably a win. No government is ever going to tell us, oh yeah, we only did that because you highlighted that in your report. But I think we take that as a mark up on the board. Now, I'm coming to really what is the absolute core of the report. We didn't think we had a monopoly of wisdom. And, it's very interesting. Marina has recently done a paper. I think she's adumbrated about 7 areas, 7 particular codes with different numbers of principles and so on, which I found extremely interesting, which we actually didn't have to hand at the time. We're just probably the 8th. With only 5, if you like. But it is interesting. We didn't say, we're the only game in town. We just suggested that this was a reasonable way of looking at the principles involved. They do cover, quite a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the prejudice, the fairness, in terms of the development for common good. We talk about the data privacy aspects, we talk about the educational aspects, and then 5, the autonomous power to hurt, destroy, or deceive human beings, which I haven't talked about today, really is all about autonomous weapons. which is, of course, of considerable importance and really does need its own international convention, which we haven't yet seen come on the table, but where there are obviously discussions. The UK is not a very active participant, sadly, but we hope that that will change over time. Of course, our report is always open to misconstruction. The narrative is one of the big issues. Whenever you open your newspapers, even the quality newspapers, you find that the killer robot is present. People think of AI, in so many ways as physical in terms of robotics, which of course is pretty misleading. But at least I suppose the Daily Mail got the moral code point across. I'm not going to talk about the leadership needed, but as you can see, there are quite a number of bodies where we made quite a lot of suggestions: AI Council, Government Office for AI, Alan Turing Institute, and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. But it's the coordination between all of those that we thought was absolutely crucial. The government response so far, so good, really. There are some very weak departments. We thought the Department for Education was pretty weak, and I'll come on to that for 1 minute. And the Department of Health were extremely weak. But actually, the main protagonists in BEIS and DCMS, they accepted the need to retain and develop public trust and the way that we do it, i.e. through an ethical approach. They've appointed a new chair, Roger Taylor, who's the new chair of the Centre for Data Ethics. And, having had conversations with them and having seen their consultation, they're definitely headed down the right track. And also, they've accepted the diversity and inclusion agenda in so many words. And they've got a commitment to a national retraining scheme. But they only accept partially the need for transparency in the use of AI. They're very defensive about apprenticeships in AI and the skill shortages, i.e. the issues relating to migration and visas and so on. Very limited understanding of the need for creative skills, which I went through earlier. So there are some weaknesses in the government response, which hopefully, as time goes on, we will give them a hard time on, and they may shift. And if you give them a hard time as well, then I think we'll all be in better business. The way ahead, well, I think I've talked a fair bit about our conclusions, not without risks, but generally optimistic if you have an ethical approach. AI policy is still in its infancy in the UK. Government's made a good start. We want to make sure that all of our recommendations are taken through by government, and that means that we need support for the conclusions that we came to. I think if I was going to nail down one thing where I really feel that the government need to step up to the plate, and that's the international dimension. We had the UK-France colloque in July, which Matt Hancock held with his opposite number in France. But we need to tie together with the Koreans, the Canadians, the Germans, the EU itself. And of course, there are other countries motoring on this. The UAE have got their own AI minister now. And funnily enough, I thought that China was going to be a very long shot on the whole ethical debate on data and so on. But you'd be amazed at the actual discussions that are taking place. Public opinion is very powerful on social media in China. And the debate about privacy and data is actually now is hitting the pages of China Daily, and I've been quite impressed by that. And who knows, in the long term, if you have sufficient dialogue, which is what you always need with Chinese debate, that may itself happen in due course. Because of course they have a number of technology companies that need to do business, want to do business with the West, and will only be able to do that if they adopt Western values, Western standards of data protection and ethical behavior in terms of AI and algorithms and so on. So I think it's watch that space in that respect. I hope I have hit the time button, and I think it's question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes of questions, and I'm sure there will be many, and this is your opportunity to ask somebody with the UK policy side of AI. Who wants to go first?
what do you imagine we need to educate people about? And the reason I ask is, when you see in the newspaper, it says this chemical makes you 40% more likely to come down with cancer. And no one in the public generally stops and says, well, what's the base rate, what's everything else? We're just not statistically educated as a people, and we don't generally ask the questions. What is it about AI we need to know that might be successful, that has failed so badly with general statistics and so many other things that we don't?
There is no single silver bullet on this. I mean, our journos write what they want, that's freedom of speech. What we have to do is try and create the narratives that actually are positive. But we can only create positive narratives if we're creating the right climate and the right context in ethical terms. So, if government is actually active in getting agreement between all the various parties on ethical frameworks, and that is a story in itself. But we've got to also talk to our students, our school children that are being educated. I mean, you only have to look at the issues about social media. I mean, AI is part of that digital understanding agenda. And what is quite worrying is that, the understanding of the ordinary school child, let alone adult actually, about what social media is all about is quite tricky. I've just been reading a great book, 10 Reasons Why You Should Delete Your Facebook Account. And, those 10 reasons are pretty powerful. But, they're really, he makes an exception for LinkedIn, by the way. How about that? Because it's got a social purpose. I mean, it's got a professional purpose, I should say. But, even on those sort of social media aspects, people don't have enough understanding. So we're starting from quite a low base on AI. But what we've got to try and do is build alternative narratives. So it's not all about Terminator robots are going to steal your job in 5 years. But what we did not do is say we need some kind of Brendan Bracken World War II Ministry of Information or something like that, or something like 1984's, Ministry of Fear, so we actually get the message across. Governments are particularly useless, actually, at communicating and getting people's trust at the same time. So actually, it's more up to us, in a sense, if you take us as the sort of non-government side of it, academics, people in business, technologists and so on, to actually get the message across. And I think that's a more fruitful way of doing it.
One of the advantages of being very old is that you've been around for a long time. And the Thatcher government in 1982, I think it was, had the year of IT. I was highly involved in that, and what I heard from you this morning maps very well onto that. In fact, except for the fact that you've used new languages and that we're now using AI instead of IT, very much of what was said this morning corresponds with what was said back in '82. Now, I'm not sure how effective that '82 year was. In fact, I don't think it was very effective. And I worry about the role of government in this, because I actually think that the market at the end of the day is really going to dictate what happens and how it's used, etc. I wonder if it is really worthwhile government being involved in the way that you are suggested it should be.
Well, you can take different views, but I think just simply leaving things like ethical frameworks to the market and the consumer's understanding as to whether or not there is an ethical framework is not going to be sufficient, because there is not enough understanding. If we were looking at a perfect market where everybody had the absolute optimum amount of information about what was out there, and they could make judgments whether to buy a product which was covered by an ethical framework or a product that wasn't covered by an ethical framework, or whether to engage in an insurance company that had an ethical code over their algorithm, for instance, that would be wonderful. But I just don't believe that markets are perfect in that sense, and that's why you need regulatory intervention, you need government intervention.
Regulatory intervention is not ethical framework. I mean, I'm quite happy to see laws passed, and if they are broken, people should be penalized in some way. But just to say it's an ethical framework, it's very soft. We'd like you to behave like this, but you don't really have to.
Well, yes. See that then in fact you're almost arguing against yourself, because what you really Well, I do it all the time too. But this is what you have to. You have to build on the ethical framework. You have the overarching ethical framework, and rather like, for instance, we've now got legislation for autonomous cars, because there's been perceived that there will be no technological development unless we get to grips with the whole issue of liability and so on and so forth with autonomous cars. That's one area of regulation that's actually had to be put into place. And if we set up the ethical framework in the first place, will inform people like the Competition and Markets Authority, all the various other bodies that we're talking about in these circumstances, Ofcom and so on and so forth. Then they will regulate if there is abuse of the system. It's not just a Pollyanna-ish idea that we've got this whole bunch of ethics that we put out there. We want basically the regulators to say, right, well, we expect this to be the way that things develop, but if they don't, then we're going to regulate. And in a sense, that allows innovation to take place, but it also means that you regulate at the appropriate time. Purely regulating on the supposition that something might go wrong, I'm not sure is actually the right way to go at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're running out of time. A last quick question and a quick answer.
Did you think of your strategy for the talent drain to the private sector, especially in tech? So how you might draw PhD computer scientists to government in order to inform policy and away from corporate research?
Yeah, it's a real issue that, this kind of poaching aspect. But of course, what they have tried to do, and Wendy Hall and Jerome Pacenti in their report recommended much greater PhD programs. But essentially, I think what they did, they came down to about 250, which is a drop in a bucket really in this area. And one can only hope that actually more funding will be available. The Turing Institute know perfectly well that what's been proposed is not going to fit the bill because of this issue about the need by technology companies for more and more PhD students, and the trouble is that or postdoctoral students. The big problem is that of course people get poached before they actually finish their thesis, and that's one of the big issues. So we've got to increase the supply. There's no doubt about that, because people can bid up people who've got the right skills at the moment. Now, that's a very nice thing to have if you've got the right skills and you're the right generation and so on. But for the totality of it, as you rightly say, it's not good for academia and it's not good for academic research.